chirp.
So today we're going to do how to tell a story in a single painting, which this is one of my favorite subjects. This is one of my favorite things to do. One of my favorite things about art just generally is the way that it transcends language, how you can express like an entire narrative just by handing somebody else who speaks any language in the world, an image that you drew. And you can communicate so much with that. And I think that's just incredible. It's so fascinating to me. So what I have today is a slideshow, and that's going to be the first 45 minutes or so. I think I've got it timed out about right. And then the last 15 minutes we'll do questions. And then I'm going to say preemptively, I'm going to go all the way to the very front outside of the building if you want to talk afterwards so that we don't clog the hallways and stuff. So you guys can migrate with me to the front out there, and I'll be out there. Awesome. All right, well, let's get going. Let's do this. So first, a little bit about me. If anybody has been through the table section already, which is Sunday, so you may have seen my Artist Alley table in the expo hall. I do a lot of illustration. You may know me from my personal work. I draw a lot of dragons and sea creatures and fantasy scenes, and then I also worked in the animation industry for 4 years, which I'll show a little bit of that. I make books. My debut book as an author illustrator came out earlier this month. I've worked in games, TV, film, both board games, tabletop games, card games, and video games. Today we're going to talk about the process of developing narrative illustration. So I'm going to walk you through all the way from my brainstorming stage through the kind of like concepting stage, and then how we can actually use the tools of pictorial composition to express the story that we want to tell. The first stage is brainstorming, so that's just coming up with generating ideas. We're going to walk through the ways that I like to generate ideas, and then also some things that I know work for some other folks that I know. Then we're going to talk about organizing that idea, so like gathering reference, creating a document that outlines, how you want to express your story, doing the pre-visualization process, and then we're going to talk about composition, and we're going to go over all the different tools of composition and how I've used them in some of my past illustrations to tell the story that I want to tell. So I began as a background artist. I worked as a background painter and then the lead background painter on a TV show called Disenchantment. And I did that for 4 years. And I learned so much through that process because in the animation industry, we can only show, each background is only on screen for such a short amount of time that we really need to express a lot and tell the audience a lot about the characters on screen and how they live, what they like to do, in their free time, the way that we decorate their bedrooms, the living spaces that they live. We're doing so much heavy lifting, but giving the audience an idea of who the character is, what their story is, just through those environments. So I learned a lot about how to tie in narrative thread, how to do storytelling with set dressing and scene building and composition. So here's some of my art from Disenchantment from through the years. These were, we in the animation industry, everything is done in stages. So I was a background painter. So that means that these were designed by other incredible artists, and frequently the color keys were also done by other incredible artists. And then I just was doing paint. I also have done a lot of work in ink. I wanted to bring this up during this talk because I learned so much about composition and expressing ideas through working in ink. Because ink, it's kind of composition in its most bare bones form. If you want to be able to tell a story, if you can tell it in an ink drawing, you can tell it really in any medium, because this gives you just the basic building blocks that you need to build the story. You have to layer light and dark in a way that creates clean silhouettes, which that's something that we do in full color work too, but when you're doing it with just grayscale, you're doing it in its most basic form. And then using things like lines of action and motion and pointing and detail contrast to lead the eye through the piece. These are all skills that you can start with in something bare bones like ink drawing, and then you can build up to more complicated art mediums that have more steps on top of it. This is kind of like ink for me is kind of like building a thumbnail and then finishing just the thumbnail, and that's something that I have found really helpful for me in my process. Is learning how to do all the things that I do in a complicated, full color piece. Doing them in ink helps me really like tighten and refine those skills. I've also worked in the publishing industry. I mentioned my first book as an author came out recently, but I've also illustrated other people's books. Something that I love about picture books specifically is that every single spread gets to be like a really full illustration or a series of smaller illustrations. You do so much storytelling and so much heavy lifting on every single spread. Here's the cover of my book that just came out recently. And a couple spreads here. So like, for example, we only see the bakery, which, the book is called The Bakery Dragon, and it's about a dragon who goes and works in a bakery. We only see the bakery itself, in just a couple spreads. So I wanted to do a lot of storytelling about the baker, who she is, the way she runs her bakery, what kind of town this is, what kind of bakery this is. It's a really small bakery. It's rustic. It's just her. This is a small room. This isn't an operation where there's lots of other bakers coming in and out. She's got everything kind of laid out where it's convenient for her. She's mixing different woods. Her furniture comes from different places. It's not like a matching set. She's kind of acquired it over time. She's got much more organic materials. It looks like maybe she built these racks herself because the wood is a little bit uneven. They don't look professionally cut. I really wanted to give you information about who she is as a character just through the set dressing and the way that the bakery is laid out. Something like the fact that she's got like uneven towels, the string that the towels are hanging from, it's uneven. She put it where it would be out of her way, so because there's a little spice rack on the left there, and she was like, well, I don't want to cover the spice rack, so she's not doing this for anybody else. She's not decorating for anyone, so she puts it sideways across the shelf. Little things like that. I love getting to do storytelling in my illustrations that way. And then same here, this is one of the main shots that we see of the town, and I really wanted the town to feel real and lived in. So, I add all kinds of little set dressing here to give you an idea, if you look closely, about what kind of town it is. For example, this is a town with dragons, and I really wanted the dragons to feel like a part of it. So I don't know if you guys can see it, but on the left side there, the weather vane has a little dragon on it. That tells you, the dragons are integrated into their society. Like, they've been living with them as a creature, like you might have a bird, or a chicken or something, a rooster on a weather vane in our world. But, if dragons are the pests in this village, then maybe they've got dragons on their weather vanes. I also do book covers. This, similar to ink drawing, is another kind of distillation of trying to like wrap up storytelling in one image, because book cover has to do so much heavy lifting. Especially, I do a lot of middle grade book covers, which are like 8 to 12 age range children's books, where they really want to give those kids an idea of like what the book is about through the cover. So for example, on the left there with Starminster, it's a wonderful book about a girl, a society where they grow wings, and this girl finds out that she's going to grow wings and live in this city up above London. And the perspective in this piece doesn't make any sense, but that doesn't matter. Like, what the purpose of it is to show you London, and then to show you there's this glistening city up above it. It's more about how it feels to have a city in the sky than how it would actually look, if we were there. Because seeing the underside of buildings just isn't as cool. But that's what I love about it, is it's really about storytelling. Oh, and then the one on the right side, The First State of Being, I really wanted to give a lot of information about the themes of the story, which it's very reflective. It's about reflecting on the past and the present. And so I was like, oh my gosh, well, it's a reflective story. What if we didn't actually see the real versions of them, but we only saw their reflections? Because so much of the story is about them reflecting on who they are and who they want to be. And like, well, then we should give them their reflections. And the character all the way on the right, I don't want to spoil this story. It's a wonderful book. But, he's not present at the end of the story for reasons, and I wanted to give a little hint of that, so you can see his feet actually aren't there in the very bottom right corner, even though his reflection is there. So you can see their reflections on him, but you can't actually see him physically in the scene. There's so much fun storytelling you can do in a book cover. Album covers too, you want to show so much about how the movie feels for a soundtrack. So these are all soundtrack vinyls. And for example, the Lightyear one, I wanted it to feel the way that it feels when you go into like a hyperspeed, like not just the scenery around you, but how it feels to have that light come over your eye and to see all the lights around you. And then some of my work, this is probably the most recognizable piece of mine, which also became the cover of my book, of course. And this piece, for example, is about the practical little dragon is outside the bakery, and he's physically stuck out there. But it's also about like the theme, the idea of seeing something so close to you but not being able to reach it. There's a barrier, there's this glass in between that prevents you from getting like what you want so bad, that warmth, that goodness when you're stuck outside in the cold rain. And then of course I had to draw him getting inside. And then here as well, we'll go over these pieces in a little more detail later, but I wanted to tell the story of there's all these different components. There's an arcade, there's this dragon that's hoarding arcade toys inside the arcade, and then we've got the little girl, and she's got her little bag, so we know she's going to try to rob the dragon. She's there with her bag to steal his treasures, but his eyes are open, so he's spotted her, so who knows what's going to happen next. And then I've always loved doing little pieces based on my own, mundane daily life. One morning, my dog woke me up earlier than usual to go outside in the morning, and it turned out that was exactly when the sprinklers went off in the lawn outside my building, and we got completely soaked, but made such a perfect little storytelling moment. I love to also come up with like little world building projects. So this was just like, what if there were griffins everywhere and they were just like the local pests, and there were some kids who go to this school and they have a club where they feed the griffins because they like them. Kind of like pigeons here. Pigeons used to be like really valued pets, and now they're out on the streets. More dragon stuff. We'll go over dragon stuff later too. I also love to do fan art, because something that I love about fan art is it gives you constraints. We'll be talking about this a little bit more later, but especially when trying to do like narrative illustration, it's so hard when the page is in front of you and you could draw anything in the entire world. It's like so hard to go from that to a finished piece. But like fan art gives you guidelines. You've kind of like the borders of the page have already been drawn for you, and you're working within a set of rules that already exist. And sometimes I think that's when I get to be most creative, when I already have those like guidelines set up. And I think for some of us that ends up being the projects that we build too, or something like, I think, for example, I know a lot of people who do fan art of Greek mythology. Like, I think that's fan art too. Just because it's not an IP doesn't mean it's not fan art of like, a thing that has existed in the world forever. Spider-Verse. I gotta love Spider-Verse. There's a little bit of storytelling here that I really wanted it to be that he's up there drawing, and he's tried over and over again to draw this same scene. So all the old versions of it, which we're all artists here for the most part. We've probably been there before, where we've done like 5 or 6 different versions of it, and he's got them all glued down around him with web. We'll go over more of these dragons later on. All right, I always, ever since I was little, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to paint illustrations that told a whole story. I was obsessed with it. Any artist that could do it, I felt like it was magic. I felt like they just like had this thing within them, and they were able to express these stories. I was just mystified by it. I loved comics, especially I was in, I think, middle school when they rebooted Spider-Man to the Ultimate Spider-Man version, and I followed that from the very beginning, and I was obsessed with that. With manga, I loved Inuyasha, and you know what? I was mainly an Inuyasha kid. I loved that comic. Animation, obviously, and games. I loved Pokemon, and I loved games so much too. Kingdom Hearts. Oh my gosh, I was obsessed with the covers of the Yotsuba manga, which this is such a wonderful little slice of life story about this little girl and her father. And the covers always just told these incredible little stories of childhood. Like they did so much personality building and storytelling. And I spent so much time looking at them and trying to copy them. And I had all these stories in my head when I was little, and I still do. They never left. But I felt like I couldn't get them out. Like what I saw in my head and what I wanted to relay, I felt like I could never do it. And I would get really down about it, because I just wanted to express these things so badly, and it wouldn't come out right. But it was because I was skipping a lot of in-between steps. I had an idea, and then I wanted it to be on the page, but I had no idea how to go from point A to point B. I was just trying to jump straight to drawing, just putting lines on the page. And I think there are some people who, from the time they're very little, they're able to do that, but that was not me. Like, I had to do a lot of skill building, and in between, brainstorming, research, gathering reference, organizing it, composing. I had to learn all of these in-between steps. So The first stage, and a very important one too, and one I still get a lot of questions a lot about, is just the plain old idea generation stage. So how do we figure out what stories we want to tell? For some people, that's not an issue at all, like the stories are overflowing. For other people, it takes, you gotta, work your way there. I don't think that that's everyone. For some people, you need to go through a process of coming up with ideas slowly, building them, gathering reference, refining them, building them more. And you know what? I have friends who fall into both camps, and the work they output is equivalently brilliant. So regardless of which camp you fall into, it says nothing about your potential to create beautiful storytelling illustrations. So if you feel like you're someone where you're like, I just don't have any ideas, my mind is drawing a blank, there's probably just middle steps you need to be taking to go from starting to think and having an idea than somebody who maybe, they're always coming out. But that person may have a lot more roadblocks in a different part of the process. So, we all bring different strengths to the table. Next, after we have an idea, which we're going to go into more depth talking about ideas and just kind of outlining the stages first. After we talk about ideas, we're going to talk about how to organize those ideas. So once we have our idea, we have to actually figure out, how are we going to relay this idea? What's the most important part of it? What are the supporting elements? Who's the main character? Who are the supporting cast? What sequence do we want the viewers to go through and see each of these, cast members in this painting? And by cast members, I mean any focal point in the piece. So, not just a character, but it could be anything in the painting that we want, someone to look at and pay attention to that's going to be pulling storytelling weight. Finally, we're going to take all of that, all of what we've done, and maybe it will be on notes in front of us, or maybe it will be just in our head, because I think we all kind of get to the end result in different ways. But we have to compose those ideas. And this is then most of the rest of it. I mean, we once coming up with the idea and figuring out what we want to do, that's only half the battle. Then we have to use the tools of composition, the very practical tools of composition, to organize our story so that it can actually be relayed properly to somebody else, so that they can go through those sequence of discoveries in the right order and pick up on all of the storytelling crumbs that we've laid out so that we can actually express that story. Because it's really easy to end up with a mess on the page to where you don't know where to look, and you hand it to somebody and they're not picking up on any of the storytelling ideas that you're trying to express. So we're going to talk about how we can actually get that idea in our head into somebody else's head. It's like telepathy, you know what I mean? Just by showing them something. It's very cool. So let's talk about ideas first. The best ideas are rarely ever just jump in, crash through the window like the Kool-Aid man and go, hey, I'm here, I'm a perfect idea, just draw me. That's very, very rare. That almost never happens, for me at least. Generally, it's a process of developing that idea through brainstorming. For some people, that process is going to be really just in their head. It's going to look like they're sitting there doing nothing, and then suddenly they just activate, turn on like a robot, and start working. For other people, they need to be drawing through it the whole time. Like, I have some friends who fill up entire sketchbooks with just working through one idea from beginning to end. And for some people, it's writing it out. For other people, it's like creating mood boards and Pinterest boards. There's so many different ways that we plan, and it's all about just figuring out what works for us best to get to that end result that we're looking for. What we want to do is start with a little idea seed, and then we're going to plant that seed, and then we're going to feed it. So we're going to feed it reference, and we're going to feed it time, and we're going to feed it our own rest so that our brain can be working well. We're going to feed it sketches, development process. We're going to feed it drafts, whatever it needs so that it can grow up into the final flourishing idea plant. So one way to start the brainstorming process, and this beginning section is probably going to be most valuable for people who find they're drawing a blank when they want to come up with ideas. Something that you could start with is a feeling. So for this piece that you see on the right here, I started with the feeling of feeling separate from a group. Feeling like everybody else is having a big party and I'm outside it. There's some barrier and I can't get through it. And I depicted that really literally here, where there's a girl who's standing outside and all of the other girls are inside going to a costume party, and they've all got these beautiful elaborate costumes on, and they're running through the halls and they're having a joyous time, and she's outside and she can't get in to see them. Another way, there are other feelings we could start with. You could start with guilt. You could start with fear. You could start with, something more specific like, the feeling of how you feel when you look at your child. There's so many different there's so many individual feelings in the human experience that we can pull from. We feel so many things through the course of a day. And sometimes when I feel something really strong that is like a fresh experience for me, like when I find, oh my gosh, like I went to, for the first time in my adult life, like a ballet performance, and I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't been since I was little. What a feeling this is to like be in this room, or if the feeling of going to a theme park, any of these feelings, that's something that you can latch onto and just save it in your head to maybe be an idea seed for later. Another way is to think of a moment. So in this piece, it's fan art of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I'm willing to bet some of you know. I wanted to paint the moment that Aang and Appa went above the clouds for the first time. So this kid has a flying bison, and this is them when they're little, when they're still quite young. Aang doesn't have his tattoos yet, and Appa's still quite small. And I just wanted to paint like the majesty of going above the cloud line for the very first time, because back before there were planes, flying that high probably wouldn't be possible. Or a concept. Moment's easy. Concept is a little bit more intricate to explain, but I guess what I mean by a concept is like the concept of a dragon that guards library books is here. So you could also paint a concept and a moment together, so that's what this is. The concept is a dragon that guards library books, a dragon that hoards library books, and then the moment is the moment that a girl is going to pay her late fees for having the books checked out for too long. So that's kind of both tied together. But then you can also do them a little separately too. Like you can do just a moment. So for example, maybe the moment that your toddler took their first steps, or the moment that you spent the last day with your dog before they had to be put down, on two far ends of the spectrum. Those are both moments that are less conceptual. But then, a concept could be the concept of a dragon with butterfly wings. I always think of dragons. Or really any sort of, concept arty, that idea generation side of things would fall into this category. And I think those are the main things that I think of when I'm coming up with ideas. A feeling, a moment, or a concept. Generally, things fall into those, and often it's a combination of the three. But I find sometimes that breaking them out into different sections, like you can kind of figure out what each side of that might be for an illustration. Breaking it out helps me think of it more clearly and really formulate, okay, what aspect of this do I want to focus on? What is this painting about? Is it about the feeling, or is it about the concept? Because sometimes those things can kind of be at odds, and you want to focus more heavily on one or the other. But thinking about ways that we can, really separate these different elements out and think of them almost like practicing chords on guitar rather than jumping right into playing a full song. We can do that with art too. We can kind of break these stages out into different parts of the process. So here's a little peek into my thought process with the Dragon Guards the Library piece. I thought of maybe it could have two different heads with two different personalities, and I thought of that because that's something that I see in like classic fiction a lot. Like when I think of books, like classic stories, classic fables, like there's a lot of like two different personalities, or like three trolls guard the bridge, or like, two different heads and one lies and one only tells the truth, that kind of thing. And then I thought about guarding a nest of books, just because, dragons usually hoard treasure. I'm always thinking of what are other kinds of treasures. I think books are another kind of treasure, especially for me. I have a lot of books. And that's where kind of the Dragon Guards the Library idea started from. Then I'm thinking of how can I add conflict? So storytelling usually often has some sort of conflict, even if it's like a really, really base level conflict, like the confliction of feeling a negative emotion. But here there's a very overt conflict of, I want to add some sort of tension. And I went through different ideas, like what if there's a thief who wants to steal the books, or an outsider who the dragon doesn't trust. Or, I worked through it and got to what are things specific to the library. Being loud is something that could be specific to the library. That would be funny, if the dragon was getting mad at someone being loud. But then I came up with late fees, and I was like, that's the one. Like late fees, that's that little, I need to work through all these other ideas to get to, what if someone was paying late fees for overdue library books? And I thought, okay, dragons like gold and riches. Maybe this girl has every valuable item she's ever known because she has a book that's been out of the library for a year, and now she owes a bucket load of late fees. And I even put an overdue notice in her backpack so that you could do, just a little bit of extra storytelling. And I added the librarian and his assistant looking quite concerned to balance out the composition. One thing that can be very valuable, especially if you're newer to the idea generation process, doing it a little more externally can be great. So doing an idea board, which is where you put the central idea in the middle, and then you can just draw arrows coming off in each direction where you can write, or you can doodle, or you can list out different options for working through your idea and getting it to a more developed stage. One question I get a lot is, what if my ideas are boring? But the secret to me is that actually some of the most boring things make some of the best paintings. I think that sometimes boring means universal. It feels boring to us because we're like, oh, everybody experiences that. But actually, I think some of the art that feels most relatable to me is stuff that it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, everybody has experienced that. And also, mundane stuff can be an amazing place to start. So I put in some art by other artists through here. Their tags are always listed on this slide here if you want to look them up. Mundane art, like art of the daily life and mundane stuff, I think connects with so many people because we love to see our own lived reality expressed. Like, who has not been to a laundromat before? It's like these things bring us together. We've all been waiting there, and maybe it takes 3 cycles to dry your clothes because you put way too much in at the same time, and you're sitting there forever, and it's so boring. Like, that is such a universal thing. These things tie us together, and humans love to bond over shared experience. We all love to eat together. We all love to gather together with our friends and families, and these things are like a universal bonding mechanism between us. And also, additionally, what feels boring to us is not going to feel boring to someone on the other side of the world who lives a really different life than us. And I think it's important to remember that too. For example, when I was growing up, I loved to read books about kids growing up in other countries. I was just obsessed with it because their lives were so different than mine. So the things that might actually feel boring to us might not feel boring to somebody else. For example, I grew up in the mountains, and I realized at some point, to people who live in the city, a lot of the activities of living in the mountains are quite different. Like, when I wanted to go to school in the morning, I had to scrape ice off the windshield of my car, and often deer broke down our fences, so I spent a lot of time kicking deer out, grabbing a big jacket and waving it at deer to get them out of our yard, and then putting the fence back up. And then in the Santa Cruz Mountains in California, we have to clear a perimeter of shrubbery every year, and it was the most boring thing in the world to me. It was going around with a big bag and pulling weeds out of the ground so that our house wouldn't burn down. But that's actually quite a fun story looking back on it, even though it felt like the most boring thing in the world to me. So those things can actually really connect us. Here's more art of just mundane but beautiful moments. A little shop. Who has not, on their way home from school, stopped with their friends to get ice cream? It's universal in such a beautiful way. Putting a twist on the well-known is also fantastic. So this is a mundane little bakery scene, but then you add ghost cats, and suddenly it becomes something fresh, new, strange. And then, of course, this is something we need to practice. We practice it just like anything else. If you spend 5 minutes a day trying to come up with an idea for a month, you're going to have so much inspiration by the end of that month. If you save it in your notes app on your phone or a journal, if you actually spend some dedicated time every day just trying to come up with an idea, you're going to get better and better at coming up with an idea. And suddenly you're going to be doing it internally, and it'll just be coming to you while you're in the most inopportune place, like when you're stuck in traffic and you've got no ability to write it down. And that's the beauty of it. Also, you should look at art that you love that does narrative illustration and really try to figure out, back engineer how the artist got to what you see in front of you. What would you have had to write down? What are the themes? What are the storytelling elements? What are the tools that were used to get there? And then I mentioned this a bit earlier, but try working within limitations as well. Start putting up guide rails for yourself. Painting anything in the entire world is hard, but if you set up guidelines for yourself, like for example, this month I'm going to design a bunch of different hybrid farm animals for a fantasy world. Great. You've got a set of borders. You've got a project for yourself. The farm animals that you design in the first half of the week are going to be some of your favorites, then you're going to have a slouch in the middle, and then by the end, those are probably going to be your very favorites, because you've worked through everything that you think, that you thought of first, and you had to think outside the box. You were forced to, because you were given limitations, and now you're iterating until you get to the good stuff. And then, like I mentioned, fan art, it can be really valuable for this. So if you're like, I don't know where to start, pick your favorite book, movie, TV show, a piece of mythology, and do your version of it, because that gives you guidelines. The guidelines are all set up already. Here's a series of mine. I love to work in series. Series give me guidelines. So for example, this series is about boys in an underwater house who are trying to find a mermaid. And they're just missing her over and over again in every direction. And there's a lot about the architecture and the design of these pieces that were guardrails that I set up. So for example, the design of it is very like concrete slabs with like these big, like brutalist square like windows, a lot of slanted angles, extremely modern. So I set myself, a style guide for the architecture, and then for the color scheme, it's very blue. It's very blue and green, and working within kind of like almost a monotone with just like accent colors. That's another set of limitations that lets me be creative, because I don't have to think, oh, what colors are it's going to be, or is it going to be? Well, it's going to be blues. It's going to be some, variation on blues. So I don't need to think about that. I can focus in on the composition and how do I take these pieces that I've already set up and arrange them in different fun and unique ways. And then my dragons are another series of that. So that's me saying, what if there were dragons in the modern world and we were interacting with them? And then what are all the different ways that they could be a part of our daily life? So for example, if we were gardening and dragons came out to visit us in the garden, or if there was a dragon that just hung out on the roof of the 7-Eleven, or of course, if there's a dragon that hoards books. Next, we need to organize. So we don't just want to have everything floating in the sky around us. We really want to take our ideas and put them in an order. And they need to be in an order so that we can then figure out how to compose around that order. So one way that I like to do this is to take our premise and write it as a sentence. So my premise for this piece is, a photographer is taking pictures of sea dragons as they fish for dinner, when suddenly a gigantic sea serpent splashes up and snatches a dragon out of the air. I did this for the Composition and Narrative 3D Total book, which is at Stuart Ing, if you want to go see the full tutorial for this piece. But then when you write it out like this, it gives you your subjects and the order of importance that you want people to go on a series of discoveries through. So for example, a photographer, bam, my focal point is the photographer. I put the darkest dark against the lightest light so that we see him first. Is taking pictures of sea dragons. We want to follow gazes, so we follow the photographer's gaze to his camera, which is shooting us straight forward to the gigantic sea serpent, which is splashing out and about to grab the sea dragon out of the air. And I put the sun right behind that sea dragon that it's eating, so that that would be the other like focal point. So your eye goes there next. It just shoots you right on over. So we're going to go through the arcade dragon piece now. This premise is a girl is attempting to rob the toy-hoarding arcade dragon, but is caught red-handed. The star of the show is the girl, mid-heist. The co-star is the dragon, spotting her from the hoard, and the setting is the toy-filled arcade with a big pile of prize toys. And so obviously I need to make her the first thing that we see. Then we want to spot the dragon secondarily. So I want the contrast, the focal point to be her. I want us to discover the dragon second, and then to really take in the setting. Next, we've got Saving the Baby Dragon. So this is a story about two kids who find a baby dragon with a torn wing in an abandoned lot with a car. And so I wanted to do the storytelling of, okay, we see the dragon, and then we see the torn wing, and then we see the boy, and he's decked out with like gloves and a helmet because he's gonna go, try to save this dragon. And then finally in the shadows, we see the girl, and she's got a little bag that she's waiting to catch the dragon with. And then the star is the injured dragon. The co-star is the kid attempting the rescue. And the setting is an overgrown, abandoned parking lot. And then I also have as Easter eggs, like the homemade armor. It's like a fun little storytelling element that they got all dressed up to go do this. Next, we're going to compose. So this is the tools that we're going to use to do that telling of the story. So once we have our ideas, we've pulled them together, we figured out what was most important, we figured out our star of the show, we figured out the supporting cast. Now we need to figure out how to actually lead the eye through the series of discoveries in the right order so that the viewer is relayed that story. We want them to be able to tell us out loud, what the story was. And the most important tool that we're going to go over is value, for sure. You're going to want to be checking your work in value all the time. This is very, very important for clarity and for read. All the other tools are extremely important too, but I know, especially when I was working in TV animation, value was the #1 thing that we did to get people to look where we want them to look. When we slap that storyboard down and we see what outfit that character is wearing, that is how we are designing what's behind them so that they stand out, so that they can act in front of the backdrop that we've set up. I've also used some other tools here, though. So I used value, of course. You can see the little girl, she silhouettes really clearly against that light background behind her, and the dragon almost blends in, because I want the dragon to be a surprise discovery. I want her to pop forward. So you can see how I condensed the values around the dragon, so the dragon is very close in value to its surroundings, whereas she silhouettes really dark against this busy midtones. Oh, and you can also see, even though all those toys are so busy back there, they are very similar in value. So you can use a lot of different colors, there's all these different hues, but as long as the value is similar to what's around it, it can create a backdrop that things can silhouette against. And then other tools I used here is we've got a lot of strong verticals going up with the scenery, and then the dragon is curving down to look at her and point at her. So that's creating, an arching force against these straights. We've got a lot of pointing happening to the character too, so I really want you to see her first. So not only did I use value, but I'm also pointing with the wings, with the dragon's head, and also with the lines of the arcade games. They're all pointing straight to the girl. So in our composition toolkit, we have contrast, which I mentioned up front, and there's different kinds of contrast. So there's value contrast, there's also hue contrast, saturation, texture, shape, detail. We're going to go over these. I've got some examples. Then we're going to go over faces and gazes, and then we're going to go over thrust, pointing, and lines of action, and intersection. So first, value contrast. This is when we put the darkest dark next to the lightest light, that is the focal point immediately. You can see that your eye goes to that division between the white and the black, and all of the other busyness, it is secondary. What is primary is the darkest dark against the lightest light. And here's some pieces that use that really effectively. So on the left here, you can see the screen of the computer there. It is right up against the dark rim of the character and the character's body, and that just makes the eye go right there. And then similarly, this is similar to an ink drawing. This is the most basic form of it on the right, where we've got a black cat against a girl, pure white against pure black contrast going on for the focal point there. And you can see that when you turn these into value, the screen is very light, and then the body is very dark, and that creates a really high point of contrast there. And it doesn't matter how busy everything is. You can see that even though there's dots all over this whole thing is covered in dots. All of the dots that are similar in value to each other, those take a big step back. And what comes forward is the little spot on the canvas where I've got the darkest darks against the lightest lights. This is just the simplest form of using value to direct the eye in a composition. And if you have a composition that is really busy and you're struggling to control it, this is the #1 thing you want to try. You want to slap a layer filled with black, set to the blending mode color on top of everything that you've done, and see if this effect is happening. And if it's not, use luminosity layers, darken layers, and lighten layers to adjust your values until you've gotten here. You're going to be in a league's different place. You're going to need to adjust the color after that, but that's the step 1. And then value grouping, we've been going over this, but this is all talking about value grouping. So it's when you group values, they turn into a shape. So for example, there's a square in the back that we can see, even though there's all these messy strokes all through it, because those values are similar, you see it as the perimeter of this square. And then there's a circle that layers perfectly on top, even though there's all these messy strokes within it going on. And then there's all these busy strokes in this triangle up front, but because it stands out against the grouped values of what's behind it, it silhouettes too. So we're doing value grouping and silhouettes together, and that's going to create the most readable compositions. So you can see I've collapsed the values on the left here, and they've become muddy. You can see the difference compared to on the right, where everything is grouping really cleanly with contrast. And I've done the same thing to this other person's art. I've ruined it on the left here. Sorry about that. But it's a good example to see how busy and messy and hard to read it is on the left versus the clean value layering on the right. Then we've got hue contrast. So cool backdrop, warm circle in front. These are the exact same value, but that doesn't matter because the hue contrast is powerful enough that the circle still cleanly silhouettes. And when you use those combined, that's when you get the most impactful. So these are both using both value layering and then a pop of color. So for the focal points here, I've used value to set up the whole composition, but then I've also popped a focal point. So for example, on the left here, the boys are in blue against the golden pillow fort, and on the right, I've given Ash from Pokemon a red hat while he's looking at this big Reggie Rock for the Pokemon fans in the audience. Then there's also saturation contrast. So this is a high saturation object will stand out against a low saturation environment, and then also vice versa. If your environment is really saturated and you put a gray on top of it, something less saturated, that will stand out as well. And I've used that both here. So these are both very low contrast environments with a pop of color right at the focal point. Then we also have shape contrast. So these are things that we can do in addition to all the things that we have set up front. You can see that your eye goes right to that triangle because all the other shapes in this piece are round. When you throw a triangle in there, that's where the eye goes. You can do this with characters. If you've got a main character and then a crowd, if you make your crowd all very round and your character very pointy, the eye is going to go straight to the pointy character. And something that I find very fun and interesting is you can see, the meme of which character in anime is the main character. They're actually using a lot of tools of composition to make that character show up as the main character. They've got different colors, they've got different shapes, and they're a lot busier. They've got a lot more going on in their character design. And your eye goes straight to them, like it works. Size contrast as well. So if you've got a bunch of small shapes, one really big shape is going to stand out immensely in the scene. And also the reverse is true. If you've got a bunch of big shapes, then one really small shape is also going to stand out. Texture contrast. This is great, especially for more design-oriented art. So, more flat art, you can use different textures to create silhouettes. You can see the circle there, but the only thing dividing it is that one texture ends and another texture is beginning. Artists who cut out like newspaper and magazine and layer those together are a really great reference for that. You can see, even if that's not the type of art that you do, collage gives us a real insight into how we can use texture to define silhouettes and to guide the eye through compositions. I love to look at art that's really different from what I do to see what little techniques I can pick up, and I definitely explore collage for that. And then noise or detail contrast is really powerful. Your eye goes to the busiest part of a painting typically, and especially when you combine that with value contrast, like put a bunch of high contrast with value, busy details right at the focal point, your eye is going to go there. Edge contrast is also really valuable. So a bunch of soft edges throughout the piece, and then if you put hard edges right where the focal point is, your eye is going to go there. And you'll notice a lot of master painters really blur out the edges in areas that aren't the focal point in their pieces. And if you have the chance to go to like the Getty or somewhere where they have these beautiful big oil paintings up, look at how blurry the edges are in all of the shadow zones in many old masters paintings, because they really knew how to take advantage of blurring out edges to guide the eye to the sharper details. So, and this is me summing up the talk. How do we create a focal point, the star of the show, using the tools of contrast? We can put dark against light right at the focal point to create value contrast. We can use a pop of another hue to create hue contrast. We can use different shape language. We can use a dramatically different size for size contrast. We can add extra details or noise. And we can use all of these tools together to lead the eye through the piece to make a series of discoveries in the order that you want the viewer to see them. I didn't go over CoStar. Of course, I have a few more slides. I'm sorry, I reordered them this morning. Creating a co-star, creating the next point down from the focal point is just using fewer of those elements. So I realized this was important. You're going to be gradating them from first you have the star of the show, but then the secondary focal point, whatever you want them to discover next, you're just going to use fewer elements of contrast. So if you use value contrast and hue contrast for the main focal point, the secondary focal point maybe just gets hue contrast, but the value is much more similar to its surroundings, or vice versa. Maybe the value stands out, but the color, the hue, is more similar to its surroundings, so that that character can take a backstage compared to the main focal point. And then we have to reduce the contrast on everything else. So this is kind of the last stage of creating a focal point and telling the story, is we need everything else to take a step back. Because if everything is taking a step forward, then nothing really has taken a step forward, and suddenly everything is busy everywhere and you don't know where to look. So that means that once we have used the tools to increase the contrast and increase the contrast of the focal point, we want to reduce the contrast on everything else. So we can group values into narrower ranges, group areas into fewer hues, and we can include less detail on everything else. And that creates harmony within everything else, so that then the area where there is the least harmony, that is the contrast, and that is where your eye goes. But you need a balance of the two. If it's just chaos everywhere, then the viewer is not going to know where to look. They're not going to know what is point A, what's point B, and what's point C. What we want to do is, first, come up with our idea. Second, order it. What's most important, second most important, third most important, and so on. And then we're going to use the tools of contrast and all the tools of composition that we went over at the end. And we're going to use the most of them on the focal point, and we're going to remove a few with each character going back in the cast. So the secondary character is going to get a little less contrast. The tertiary character, a little less contrast. And we're going to go all the way until we've run out of all of the storytelling elements in our composition, and we're just painting the backdrop, which we need to take a big step back. That's the stage. We're using all the tools of composition in reverse to make it take a step back so that all of our stars can come forward. And what you have at the end of it is a narrative storytelling illustration.